Welcome back, everybody. We've been getting a ton of questions and comments this week, and a lot of them are about the same thing. Real Madrid's schedule. It just seems absolutely crazy packed, and a lot of you are worried about how the players are going to hold up. It's a very real concern, player fatigue. So that's exactly what we are going to dive into today, really unpacking this idea and giving you everything you need to know without getting lost in a sea of stats and figures.
That's right. I mean, we're not just talking about a couple extra gains here and there, are we? We're talking about something much bigger, a real shift in the demands being placed on these players. So we're going to take a close look at all the different factors that have contributed to this pretty unusual situation, how this might impact the team's performance throughout the season, and really get into the different viewpoints that are swirling around this whole topic of intense demands in modern football.
Absolutely. And we have a lot to work with. There's been some really interesting stuff out there, especially. And our goal, as always, is to help you cut through the noise and really get to the heart of what matters. We want to uncover those hidden details that really reveal the incredible workload these players are dealing with and help you understand the real implications for you as a fan closely following the team. So yeah, let's get right into it. I guess the first thing that jumps out at you is just the sheer volume of games.
You hit the nail on the head there. It's the first thing anyone talks about, right? Just how many matches could Real Madrid potentially end up playing this season? And the number that keeps coming up is, well, it's almost hard to believe, 72. 72 official matches if they go all the way in every single competition. I mean, that's a historic number in club football. It's a huge ask.
72. It's hard to even picture what that looks like across a whole season. And even if they don't make it to every final, it's worth pointing out that they've already played 48 games as we are recording this. And they're guaranteed to play at least 64 no matter what. So, for those of you keeping track at home, we are talking 10 more matches in La Liga, potentially more than just 2 in the Champions League, depending on how far they go, the Copa del Rey semifinal, and of course those 3 Club World Cup matches.
And then you got to factor in the incredibly tight turnaround if they were to reach that Champions League final, which, as we know, is scheduled for July 13th. The next official match after that, the Supercopa de España, could be as early as August 10th. And then the La Liga season could kick off just a few days later, potentially around August 15th. So we're talking about an incredibly short off-season, barely any time to rest and recover before it all starts up again.
It really is like a never-ending cycle at this point. And, it's not just a feeling. Real Madrid has actually played 4 more matches this season compared to what has been typical in recent years. So what's causing this noticeable increase? What's driving this?
Well, it's not random, that's for sure. The new format of the Supercopa de España is definitely a major factor. That added 2 extra games right off the bat. And then you have Real Madrid's participation in the new Club World Cup format, which, again, added another 2 fixtures to their calendar. So that's 4 right there.
So those changes to how these competitions are structured have had a direct and significant impact. And it sounds like the timing of these extra fixtures was particularly tough on the team.
Yeah, definitely. They went through a really brutal stretch in January, February, March. Trying to squeeze those 4 extra matches into an already jam-packed schedule has left very little room for rest and recovery.
Which brings us to what's probably on everyone's mind. The impact of all this on the team. It's got to be taking its toll, both in terms of fatigue and the risk of injury.
There's no doubt about that. There's a stat that's been going around. 22 matches in just 74 days, with only 7 free days in between. That is a grueling schedule, that kind of intensity, with barely any time to catch your breath. It's bound to lead to both physical and mental exhaustion. And of course, you can't ignore the heightened risk of injuries when players are constantly pushing themselves to the limit. This type of schedule could also have longer-term effects on the team. For instance, Ancelotti might not have as much freedom to experiment with different tactics or give younger players like Arda Güler valuable minutes, so there's a potential knock-on effect on player development and even the team's long-term tactical flexibility.
Yeah, you're right. And it's not just speculation, right? There are reports of genuine concern within the club about players potentially breaking down under the strain. They even use the phrase dropping like flies, which paints a pretty vivid picture. And then there's the example of Mbappe reportedly saying he felt completely dead after a recent match. But the thing that really surprised me was how Real Madrid seems to be viewing international breaks these days.
It's almost a complete role reversal, isn't it? Usually, clubs are dreading international breaks, worried about their players getting injured or coming back exhausted. But according to some reports, Real Madrid are actually welcoming these breaks now as a chance for their players to finally get some proper rest. That says a lot about the kind of pressure cooker they've been operating under week in and week out. I mean, it's almost ironic. International breaks, usually a source of anxiety for clubs, are now seen as a chance to recharge. It really makes you wonder about the sustainability of the current system, doesn't it? If national team duty is essentially a form of rest and recuperation from club football, then something is clearly out of whack.
It's definitely a sign of the times, and we're already seeing the physical toll this relentless schedule is taking. The recent news about Fran Garcia picking up an injury during training, that's a stark reminder of the risks involved.
Absolutely. It just underscores the fragility of even the fittest athletes when they're constantly being pushed to their limits with minimal time for their bodies to properly recover. And it's not just the physical strain, is it? There seems to be a sense of tension within the club itself. It's almost palpable.
Yeah, there's definitely a feeling that Real Madrid are under a lot of pressure this season, and maybe some of that pressure is coming from within the fan base itself, perhaps unrealistic expectations based on past glories and not taking into account the unique challenges of this season.
It's a valid point. There's this idea floating around that both the players and the coaching staff desperately need a break from each other, even just mentally. That really speaks volumes about the pressure cooker environment they're in.
And, some people were even suggesting that Ancelotti's job might have been on the line recently. That shows just how high the stakes are, how much pressure is riding on each and every game in this compressed calendar.
Absolutely. And of course, all of this is happening against the backdrop of some fairly public disagreements about match scheduling. There was that whole thing about Real Madrid's supposed stance on not playing games with less than 72 hours of rest in between.
Right, that made some headlines, but it sounds like it wasn't quite as black and white as it was initially portrayed, was it?
It seems like the real issue was the specific timing of a particular match. It wasn't so much about a hard and fast rule of 72 hours of rest, but rather about the difference between playing on a Saturday versus a Sunday. That extra day of recovery could make a real difference. So it was more about being strategic and maximizing those precious few windows of rest.
Which is completely understandable when you think about it. Every little bit helps at this level. And this actually ties back to what Ancelotti was saying earlier in the season about trying to implement personalized rest schedules for players. But it sounds like that plan has been difficult to put into practice.
Well, as we've seen, even the best laid plans often go awry in the face of such a demanding schedule. And the injuries have definitely thrown a wrench into things. When you have key players missing, it becomes much harder to give others a break. You're forced to rely on your strongest available lineup more often than not. Ancelotti might have wanted to rest key players for entire matches or even give them a short run of games off during less crucial Liga fixtures, but injuries have pretty much made that impossible.
So with all these injury concerns, particularly in defense, with Mendy still out and now this issue with Fran Garcia, what are the potential solutions being discussed? What's the plan B?
Well, it seems they might be looking at all their options. There's talk of both Mendy and Fran Garcia potentially missing the upcoming match against Leganés. And one name that has come up as a potential emergency option is a young left back from the under-19s, a kid named Balde. Quite a situation for a young player to be thrown into if he gets the call.
Yeah, that's always an interesting storyline to follow. Talk about trial by fire. But what about other options, more experienced players who could step in? Alaba's name was mentioned, wasn't it?
Yeah, he's obviously a very versatile player and has played at left back before, but there are also some reservations about whether that's the ideal solution right now. He might be needed elsewhere, and they might prefer to use him in his more natural positions if possible.
Right. It's all about finding the right balance, isn't it? You don't want to be shuffling players around too much, especially when the stakes are so high. Some good news on the injury front, though. It seems Tchouaméni is expected to be back for that crucial match against Arsenal. So at least some reinforcements are on the way.
It's definitely a boost to have him back. Every player counts, especially when you're juggling multiple competitions. And this whole situation has really brought into focus the challenges of preparing for a season like this. It seems those long and leisurely preseason training camps are becoming a thing of the past.
Yeah, it's almost like they're a luxury that modern football just can't afford anymore, right?
That seems to be the consensus. There's simply not enough time in the calendar for that kind of extended preparation anymore. And this could have some interesting implications for next season, especially with the Club World Cup final being so late in July. It definitely adds another layer of complexity. The rules usually require teams to have at least 21 days of rest after a major tournament or final. So if Real Madrid or Atletico Madrid were to reach the Club World Cup final, they might need a later start to the next La Liga season. It's supposed to kick off around August 15th, but that could all change depending on how things play out in that tournament.
So even next season is being impacted by this incredibly congested schedule. It's a ripple effect. Okay, so let's try and sum all of this up. What, for you, is the biggest takeaway from this deep dive into Real Madrid's current situation?
I think the key point is that Real Madrid are facing an unprecedented level of demand this season. The expansion of existing tournaments and the introduction of new ones have created a perfect storm, leading to a historically high number of potential matches. And that inevitably raises major concerns about player fatigue, the risk of injuries, and the overall sustainability of this relentless schedule.
And it's created some pretty unusual situations, like international breaks now being seen as a positive thing, a chance for players to actually recover. It's a real shift in perspective.
It really highlights the extreme demands being placed on elite footballers these days. It makes you think about the long-term implications for their well-being.
Absolutely. So here's a final thought for everyone listening. Given all of this, what do you think this means for Real Madrid? How will they cope with this relentless pressure? How will it affect their performance this season and even their long-term plans for squad development and player management? And even bigger picture, what does this tell us about the state of modern football? Is this level of intensity sustainable? Are we pushing these players too far? These are questions worth pondering. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.
See ya.